In this video, we're going to talk about inefficient production. So let's say we're looking at an economy that can produce two goods. It can produce food and it can produce steel. And if it's strictly focused on producing food, it would produce 100 million tons of food. Whereas if it's strictly focused on producing steel, it would have 50 million tons of steel. And we know that all the different points that are along this line, our production possibilities frontier, that's this curve here, all the points along this line are different combinations of food and steel. And as long as we're along this line, we'll say that the combinations are efficient in production, or that we have achieved production efficiency, which means that we couldn't produce an additional unit of one good without decreasing production of the other good. So for example, let's say that we were at this point right here, and let's say that this was 90 million tons of food, and then that meant 40 million tons of steel, right? So at this point, for us to go, so we got 90 million and 40 million. So for us to go to 91 million tons of food, we would have to give up some steel, right? We couldn't reach this point right here, for example, right? We can't reach it. It's not feasible. But you might be wondering, what about all the points in the interior, right? All these points in here. Can't we get those points, right? The points outside, right? So when we say we're outside the PPF, we know that those are not feasible. They're not feasible. It means we can't reach them with the current level of resources that we have. But what about all the points on the interior? Aren't these feasible, you might be asking? And the answer is yes. They are feasible. We could reach any of these points. But we don't want to do that, right? We don't want to do that. We want to be on this line because that's efficient in production. And so you might be thinking, okay, well, why do we even care? Well, let's take this point right here, right? So let's take this point. So this point, let's say, corresponds to the 40 million tons of steel, and then it corresponds to, let's say, 60 million tons of food. So you'd say, well, what's wrong with this point? Well, this point we could get to right here without giving up any steel, right? Because this is 90 million tons of food and 40 million tons of steel. So why would we take 60 million tons of food and 40 million tons of steel? Without giving up any steel, we could get an additional 30 million tons of food. So obviously this point is better. So that's why all these points along this curve are efficient in production. So you might be wondering then, why would we ever end up at this point, right? How would we ever end up on the interior of the PPF? Because it's certainly possible, and it'd be foolish for an economy to choose. Why would somebody choose that they want one of these combinations inside the PPF? And there's a couple of reasons that an economy could end up with inefficient production. And one of the reasons is that resources are being misallocated. All these points in here, right? We're reaching them with the resources that we have in the economy, right? We're talking about resources, our people, their machines, and so forth. They're all the things that we use to produce steel and food, right? So we have some level of resources, and we're bounded by this curve here of how much food and steel we can produce given the current level of resources. But if resources are being misallocated somehow, if they're not being used wisely, then that means that we could actually not be producing at a point that's efficient in production, but we're at one of these points on the interior which are inefficient, right? So these are inefficient. So I want to give you an example of inefficient production, or this misallocation. You might be wondering. So China in the late 1960s embarked on a program called the Great Leap Forward. Right? And so one of the things with the Great Leap Forward was that the government wanted to increase production of steel. So they wanted to, and they set quotas. And so a lot of people who were farmers and stuff, they had quotas that they needed to meet of the amount of steel that they could produce, right? They needed to get steel. And so what they would do in some cases, they were actually melting down farm equipment, right? So they would melt down farm equipment so that they could get scrap metal, right? That then they would melt and say, hey, we've got some steel here, right? So we got the ability to make steel. Basically, pig iron was, you can look that up if you're curious about it. They were making pig iron, right? So they're melting farm equipment to get pig iron, which in a lot of cases the pig iron wasn't even usable, right? It was not usable. There were problems with the pig iron and so forth. And so you could think about this as a misallocation of resources because a lot of people, millions of people, ended up starving because there wasn't enough food, right? So you can think of it as we're at a point like this right here where it's inefficient. They could have, if they, instead of melting down the farm equipment, they had instead used it to produce more food, maybe they would have been able to have 90 million tons of food instead of 60 million, for example, right? These, I don't know how accurate these numbers are. I just picked them out of a hat. So the idea is that we're not using the resources in the right way, right? Each resource, we want to use it in the best way possible. If we have a bunch of farm equipment, the farm equipment is best suited to be producing food. It's not really well suited for us to melt it down, make pig iron, so that we can try and increase our steel production. So that's a misallocation of resources, and it can lead to where we're actually at an inefficient point of production. Another thing would it be if resources are simply being wasted, right? And so when we think about resources being wasted, well, we come back to, well, what are resources? Well, we've got people, we've got machines, we've got buildings, right? So let's say you have, for example, in the United States, you have a lot of vacant buildings, particularly in urban areas, right? And so metropolitan areas, you will have a lot of vacant buildings or vacant land. Right? Land that's not being used for agricultural purposes. There's no food being grown there. It's not being used for commercial purposes. They're just buildings sitting there, or there's land, right, due to deindustrialization. And so these are resources that are being wasted, right? They're being wasted. You could even think of people being wasted, right? If there's really high unemployment, there's a lot of people who could be doing something, but for whatever reason, the economy is not using them, right? So you end up at some point inside the PPF where theoretically, based on the resource that you have, you actually could get to a point on that PPF without giving up more steel. You could actually get more food or vice versa, right? But because resources are being wasted, not all the resources are being used, or they're not being put to their best use in terms of the misallocation, you can end up with one of these inefficient levels of production.